This is House Planning Help episode 139. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Alongside this, I still want to tackle my own project and create an energy-efficient home. Originally, I wanted to do this before I turned 40, which is just a few weeks away now. And coming up in this session, my guest is Tomas Gartner from Gale and Snowden Architects. We're going to be looking at building biology, finding out what it is, why it's beneficial, how we might implement it, and so forth. It's been a while since I've told you about my land quest and looking for somewhere to build my house. And the reason for that is that, well, there doesn't seem to have been much on the market, not as many opportunities as there have in the past, particularly the spring versus the summer. So it could be that change, or could this be something bigger? Could it be associated with Brexit and just people not sure where this is going to go? We're all expecting a downturn, but so far, okay, the currency has been devalued. We haven't seen much more, although I think we're all expecting it. And I know my friend Mike Coe, who's trying to sell the autonomous house at the moment, says it just seems really quiet out there and the interest level's been low. So I just wonder whether you are someone who's experienced that too. And the other thing is that there's a flip side to this. If you are searching for the right plot, that perhaps if we are heading for a downturn, that if you're placed well and ready to go and still not scared by the fact that we are heading into a downturn, it does bring a lot of opportunity our way, potentially, because people might still be looking to sell or being forced to sell, and we can be there ready to go. Whereas a lot of the times that I've tried to get land, it's going to the highest bidder and it's sealed bids where you just think, oh, this is ridiculous because I don't know who I'm up against. I might be going way over the odds and no one else is interested. Don't like that system. Let's get to our featured interview. Tomas Gartner from Gale and Snowden Architects is my guest, and we're going to be looking at building biology. The reason being that this is all about your living environment and it's got a strong emphasis on health. So that's right up our street. And I started this conversation by asking Tomas to just explain a little bit of background on how he came to work in this area.
I'm an architect, so I studied architecture in Germany and worked in Germany as an architect for 4 or 5 years before I came over, and then started pretty much straight away to work for Gale and Snowden back in 2007 when I came here. And Gale and Snowden, they focus on sustainable design, they focus on low energy, ecological design. To be fair, up to that point, I've worked in commercial practices, interior design, architecture, things like that. Not necessarily eco at all. Standards in Germany, however, were at the time considerably higher than here. So we were insulating buildings to a considerably higher level. Air tightness was on the agenda. Passive house was much more typical. So you had clients even come into commercial practices and demanding a passive house. So you wouldn't go to specialist designers at the time, really. So I had some experience in that field already, but I wouldn't classify at all at ecological or anything like that, really. That was not the driver for most of our projects.
And building biology, was that something you learnt over here or something you brought from Germany?
I studied building biology in Germany, but that came later on. So when I was here, I first got more involved with ecological design, sustainable design. I went on the BREEAM assessor course, became a code assessor as well at the time. Then I did a passive house course back in 2009 in Scotland, at Strathclyde University actually. That's when we were doing our first passive houses in Exeter. And that's really what brought me closer to building biology. Gale and Snowden was always using building biology principles, and David Gale was always quite into it. The course wasn't available in English. There's just the American course that was available in English, and that is a bit out of date, really. So I think the material is something like 12 years old, which, when it comes to health and medical science, is quite a bit, because things change very quickly in that field, and also if you look at materials and so on. So, but when we did our first passive houses, what we noticed, and I noticed, is that we moved quite a bit away from our key principles in terms of materials and how we designed sustainable buildings before. To be fair, back in 2009, there were not that many passive houses around in the UK. There was the first office building in Wales, and we played it probably also safe. We used systems that were well understood for passive house, well used in passive house on the continent, to achieve the thermal bridging, to achieve the air tightness, the tapes, the windows, some insulation products that helped to achieve it as well. And we compromised more on our principles in terms of what materials we tend to use, more recycled natural materials. to improve the air quality. And although our first passive houses were very successful in terms of comfort, air quality probably as well, and energy performance, it was also noticeable there was this very strong focus that has driven that project. And so that was the time when I got more involved with building biology, which gives more a broader picture, a more holistic approach to achieving sustainable low-energy buildings with a more human-focused.
Okay, where do we start with building biology?
Where building biology is coming from is it's from the 60s, and it evolved in the 60s in Germany as a response to the changing market in construction materials and also demand. After the war, the economy in Germany picked up considerably, especially towards the beginning of the 60s, and construction activity picked up considerably, and yet more large-scale developments. And suddenly, to cover that demand, of course, the industry responded to that with more highly processed goods, which could be quicker erected, quicker installed, shorter drying time, also more economic, cheaper materials as well at the same time. And that was driving material development. Up to that point, probably 80 to 90% of materials were standard materials which were used for hundreds of years. Brick, concrete, glass, timber. That was typically what you found for 90% on construction sites. Today, probably 90-95% of construction materials have a petrochemical content and are highly processed. You have adhesives, for example, you have additives for concrete, for clay, you have coatings for glass, you have treatments for timber on all these projects. And of course, all these different chemicals that go into buildings are not that well understood. They have not been used for a long time. And even though they're in very, very low concentrations, which is generally considered as safe if you look at it in isolation, if you look at the combination, what you put into a buildings and how all this adds up, there's no standard that covers that and has not been looked at by any regulation. And this led to the development of building biology in the 60s, where it was about, right, let's have a look into these chemicals. What are they actually? What we're using there? In isolation, are they a health risk? And can we do without them? So it's not about, no, you can't use them, but it's more about, if they are a health risk, is there an alternative that we can use economically, but also technically, without compromising on its performance, which takes that risk out of the building? And that's very much what building biology is about. It's more about assessing the risk for all the different fields, and it covers air quality, it covers materials, it covers radiation, but it also covers the design itself, the urban design, how we create socio-economic, ecological forms of living. And there's a strong focus on the living environment. So it deals with dwellings, housing mainly, but nowadays also commercial projects. We use it quite a lot on offices as well. We're building Exeter's Leisure Centre at the moment to building biology principles, and most of our housing projects really as well.
Let's look at some of those factors that you mentioned. For example, air quality. If we're looking at materials and thinking air quality, well, is passive house not one of the good things that we know we're getting air changes, so surely dilution will help us almost eradicate that problem?
Well, it's fighting the symptoms, isn't it? What passive house doesn't look at what materials you use. You can put it together as a passive house, which in terms of materials, if you want to, and if you push it, can be a real pig. And it can still be a passive house in terms of materials you put in. It is true, you have relatively good air quality through ventilation when you compare it to a naturally ventilated building on a passive house. However, there are also studies out there that just by developing a passive house and building to passive house doesn't necessarily mean you end up with that high air quality. There are passive houses that also fail on there. So there's a lot of way also about how you design your passive house, how you design your ventilation system, how you commission it as well in the first place. But what building biology is about is one step before that, actually. It's not looking at, right, let's put together a building, don't care what it is, because we have a ventilation system that takes it away anyway. We take it one step before that, is what materials are we using in the first place? Minimize these emissions from these materials, potential risks to it, before we then look at the ventilation strategy and get a ventilation strategy that is as good as possible. And passive house, also under building biology, is a very valid strategy to achieve a low energy building with high quality air quality. So this is doable, and this is perfectly fine under building biology credentials. It adds the material side to it, a bit more consideration there. The thing is also, any ventilation strategy doesn't take out all pollutants. What it does do, it mixes it reduces the concentration of pollutants in the building. You still have constantly off-gassing in there. And if a resident is very sensitive to certain chemicals, then he will still react to that. If you look at winter times, and some passive houses, that's what we found in our buildings, and we've developed more than 50 passive houses on site so far and have monitored a majority of these long term, that we have considerably better air quality than average in our buildings. If you look at CO2 levels, they're easily within below 1,000 ppm in these buildings, and they're perceived as very fresh air in these buildings as well. However, 1,000 ppm, if you look at it, is still considerably higher than outside air, natural air, which you can achieve. And this is also down to what we feel is that, for example, the recommendation for air quality or ventilation rates from passive house of 0.3 as a minimum, which, yes, you won't suffocate in there and it will take most humidity out there if the building is designed in the proper way, and if the ventilation system is designed properly, then the 0.3 air changes can do it. However, it doesn't give you a huge margin for error in terms of materials, in terms of possibly drying out times for materials. If you have a new build, you've still humidity coming out of construction materials. You still have a higher degree of off-gassing in the first few years. So possibly, rather than pushing and trying to squeeze out every kilowatt hour on your ventilation rate, it would be advisable to go more for the 0.5 air changes, which immediately gives you better air quality in the building, but you compromise slightly on the energy side. But that's again what building biology is about, or what our approach is about. It's a human-focused. We first start with an optimum environment. We don't compromise on the environment, on the human needs for the people in terms of air quality and water quality. And once we've established what an optimum human environment is and what the demand is, we then try to achieve that in an as energy efficient and economic way as possible.
So does that change? You mentioned for the human. Are we just saying, humans are more or less the same, or it changes from person to person?
It changes. Everyone is different, and that's my experience from monitoring our passive houses, which also gave us the opportunity to stay in contact with residents in these buildings. And we have quite a mix of passive houses. We have a range of private clients where we've developed passive houses over the last years, and that's relatively straightforward because you design the building for them. You understand their need, and you design and develop the building itself, but also the service strategy, the ventilation strategy, and what you put into the building for these people. You educate them at the same time, of course, what they can do, how it should be used. A lot of our buildings are council houses, and the residents who move in there, they don't even know they're moving in a passive house quite often. They're top of the list and end up in a passive house, which is what it is for them, really. So they're more dropped into it. And what we there find is, of course, that they use them in very different ways. Some of them get on with it very well, others don't, others need some help as well, and everyone is different. Some people want fresh air. They want to open windows. In all our passive houses, you can open windows, and that's perfectly fine. You don't get the energy efficiency out of it, but it's still a very energy efficient building. Some people are comfortable at 17 degrees, 18 degrees, others need 25 degrees. And there's nothing wrong with it, and it's not down to me to tell anybody how they have to live. We provide people with a tool to live a healthy, low-carbon lifestyle. And that's what we consider our buildings to be, really, in the end. We do give them a hand in terms of suggesting to them that they should try out maybe a lower temperature, a degree less, can save them some energy, see how comfortable you feel. It might be just because you're used to it, where you lived before. And that's why we sort of try to guide them a bit, how they can get more out of it. But that's how we leave it in the end. People are very different, and that's also important when it is about healthy building design. It's important to understand for whom you're designing the building, who will be using it. Is it a vulnerable user group? Do I know the client who goes in there? Do they have certain allergies, for example? So I can tailor it for them. If I can't tailor it for them, for us that means we should advise our client what they can do so that it's a healthy environment, or generally perceived a healthy environment for the majority of people. Or if a client wants to make the conscious decision, for example, to exclude some people by specifying a certain level of air quality they want to achieve. So what we normally recommend to our client is look at the building biology standard for testing methods. And that is a standard developed from the Building Biology Institute in the 80s and has been updated. The latest version is 2015. This is not a certification standard. It's not a standard that will give you a t-shirt at the end. What it is about, it's a standard, and it's relatively short. It's 3 pages of numbers, and it defines clearly a healthy indoor environment in terms of
3 pages. That's pretty good in this world.
It is. And what it does, it defines healthy levels of potential hazards in the indoor environment, for example. So pollutants, we look at formaldehyde, we look at VOC levels, we look at the indoor climate in terms of humidity, CO2, we look at temperatures, surface temperatures and air temperature in there, but we also look at radiation, we look at dust, we look at particles, we look at mold.
So these were the things that you mentioned earlier on as well. Radiation, what do we get radiation from?
Well, radiation we get from household electricity and mobile phones. DECT, Wi-Fi, these things. Now, it's quite often that building biology is reduced to materials and radiation, and this is one of the things that always comes up, of course.
Oh, okay.
Even more in commercial developments, because nowadays people feel it's impossible not to have a mobile phone or Wi-Fi connection, and we can't live without it. Now, if we go back 10 years, there was no Wi-Fi everywhere. People weren't that concerned about it. It wasn't that much of an issue. But nowadays, of course, also with the Internet of Things, connectivity becomes much more of an issue. However, both household electricity, the magnetic fields from it, as well as high-frequency radiation from mobile phones, DECT telephones, Wi-Fi, is on the list of potentially carcinogenic agents from the World Health Organization. Now, for me as an architect, and when it is about healthy building design, I rely on advice from specialists. These figures from the World Health Organizations, they are based on studies, a wide range of studies in this field. It is not that clear with radiation how it is leading to cancer, but what it is clear is that there seems to be an increased risk for certain types of cancer where people are exposed to higher rates of radiation. Now, the thing is not that the moment where you have household electricity, you are at risk. There's a threshold, which is reasonably high. The same for Wi-Fi and the same for mobile phones. There's a threshold which is reasonably high. That threshold from the World Health Organization is 100 nanowatt per square meter. The UK threshold is 10 billion nanowatt per square meter. Now, that is not to protect human beings. But the surprising thing about it is, if the World Health Organization says 100 nanowatt is fine, if you look at the small print on your mobile phone when you buy it, in the user manual, this mobile phone has to work at 0.01 nanowatt per square meter. So in theory, if you limit the World Health Organization's limit, you can still use a mobile phone everywhere. But it's not been done because it means you have to put up more mobile masts, because you have to run it at the lower strength. So that means your distribution network needs to be more small scale, and you need to assess these more critically. And of course, the industry doesn't have an interest in that at all, because of costs in there as well. The issue is also, it's with a lot of things in medical science, is not as clear as it is, for example, for energy. You have a very close relationship between cause or action and reaction, cause and result. If I put insulation on my building, I reduce my energy demand. Relatively easy. In medical science, it's not that easy. If I hit my hand with a hammer, I feel pain. Cancer is not that straightforward. Cancer develops relatively slowly, and it's not that easy to tell, if I get cancer, where did I actually get it from in the first place? And this is the same, of course, when we look at allergies. This is the same, of course, when we look at cancer in these fields as well. For us, we use a precautionary principle. We're not looking at, can we demonstrate this agent, formaldehyde, asbestos, or radiation, which are all on the same list of carcinogenic substances, more or less. Does it really lead to cancer? That's not for me to decide. It's a risk. We base it on the precautionary principle, and what we do in building biology is we try to design it out and minimize where possible. And it's not we can't have it at all. It is also about the exposure rate. We try to minimize it first to a safe level, and we try to take it out in areas where we spend a lot of time. So we try to take it out in bed spaces, sleeping areas, for example. That's the first thing. If you're sleeping, you don't need Wi-Fi, you don't need a mobile phone. You have probably a better sleep if you don't have access to your emails, and especially when you don't check your emails before you go to bed, because you just start to worry anyway about work and stuff like that.
So if we have our phone on beside our bed, that's just a silly thing to do.
It is. The mobile phone, even if it's switched off, will build up a connection every 30 seconds, roughly, just to check on the connectivity. It checks on, pulls some emails or data connection from your different apps and so on. So that's what it does. What I would recommend is, if you need your phone next to you because you want to check your time, or you have whatever on there, your alarm clock set on that, switch it into flight mode. The moment where you switch it into flight mode, it will not build up connections and is relatively safe. So they're relatively simple strategies what you can do. What I do at home, I switch off my router. Yes, I do have Wi-Fi at home because, of course, we have all the gadgets at home as well. However, I try to minimize it at home, and I recommend it to my clients. Do you need Wi-Fi at night? Probably not. Why would you? Unless you have some devices that you need for monitoring your health or whatever, for example. There's no reason to have Wi-Fi at night. So in our house, it's on a timer and it switches off automatically at night.
So how easy is it to design out a lot of these things and make sure that you're embracing them? Is this easy, or actually in some cases quite hard?
it depends how far you want to take it. As I said, it's a voluntary standard. It's not a certification scheme. It's not about getting the T-shirt. It's about improving it where possible. And that is the golden principle. We want to come to a natural, or as close to a natural, undisturbed environment as possible. The environment where the human body evolved in, to minimize these risks. So for some areas, it's relatively easy and relatively straightforward, and also to come to a relatively safe level for most of us. If you look, however, at especially vulnerable residents, or residents who suffer from certain allergies, or are hypersensitive to a wide range of chemicals, which there's nowadays probably 6% of the population, then of course it can get more restrictive in terms of materials in there. So for example, in our buildings, we use these principles to come to a very good standard that meets probably the category of no concern, or very low concern of the building biology testing method standard. And that's easily done without any on costs and just by design. If you look, for example, taking the radiation example again, because it sort of stirs up people most, it is more about, for example, the layout of our wiring. We use a radial wiring system, so that means every room has its own circuit, so we can cut out each and every room. We don't get any pollutant from another room into that wiring system. We then create a distance from our bed space to potential appliances. Sockets around the bed, we move away 0.5 meter. That's enough already. It will drop down immediately. What we found in bed spaces where it's not been taken into account, you can easily find the magnetic fields you would find under high voltage power lines. Now, nobody would buy a house under high voltage power lines who is concerned about their health, probably, if they have a choice. But in our living environment, we're not that concerned about it. People are also not aware of it, that if you, for example, have an alarm clock hardwired in right next to your head at the bed, you probably have these kind of fields. If you move it away 0.5 meter, a meter, that drops down to a reasonable level immediately. So these are the strategies you can do. You can then move it away. Where you have a solid construction with chased-in cables, typically the fields drop down to relatively low levels. When you have a lightweight construction, you can either work with distance or you can use shielded cables. Shielded cables, it's an on-cost just on the cable, probably £20 per 100 meter. It's not huge in that, but it reduces these fields considerably and makes the environment more safe. So the on-cost, if you know what you're doing and design it in from the start, is not that high. In terms of materials, the big problem in terms of materials is first of all getting the information. You don't get, no matter how hard you try, and I've tried it as an architect, a full product declarations from most suppliers. They will not tell you what's in their paints. And probably for a good reason. I mean, they say it's their company secrets and it's the magic in their product. It's probably more because they would be quite concerned about the components in these paints. Especially when you think of that traditional paints like lime paint, some casein paints and so on, they contain 4 to 5 different substances. And that makes a wide wall. Modern paints have more than 150 substances in them. And most of them are on the list of carcinogenic substances. They are in there in a very, very small amount. But if you then think about, you put in 2, 3, 4 coats of these, you then have some timber treatments as well, in terms of varnishes on your floors as well, you have some fire retardants that go into these products as well, you have some drying agents and so on that come into construction. Most of these substances that are in modern paints do nothing for the end user. They don't make the wall much whiter or that you have to paint it less often. It only helps with the drying time. You can hand over the building a bit quicker. It makes it a bit easier to apply in the first place. But who loses out is the end user, who then has to deal with the chemicals and the off-gassing, especially in the first few months and years. And that's where you can design it out. These paints, healthy paints, natural paints, paints that don't have these substances in there, are still readily available. Lime paints, mineral paints are available on the market. You also get some casein paints on the market. All these traditional paints are still on the market. And an experienced decorator is still perfectly able to use them. The on-cost for these are not much higher than a good trade paint in terms of quality. And the finish you achieve is of similar quality as well. It's just knowing where to look for, but first of all, of course, getting that information. And this is something which is at the heart of building biology, is first about educating people. It's making people aware, rather than imposing a standard and telling people, this is what you have to use, don't use that one, and that makes a healthy building. It's making people aware, looking into it, where are the risks, assessing that first, and how can I take them out.
Can we talk about water?
Yeah. Water quality in the UK, believe it or not, is actually relatively good. So it's since 1995, it's a European standard that is used throughout Europe for water quality, a minimum water quality. It's considerably better than, for example, in countries like the US, where you have relatively high chlorine in the water, which you wouldn't normally have in the UK. And of course, there are always instances where that system fails and you get, of course, some bacteria issues and so on sometimes. But generally, water quality in the UK is relatively good. So what it is then about is more about maintaining that water quality within your building, because that water quality is only controlled right up to your water meter, more or less. From then, you take over. So then it's about the materials in there. And if you look at old houses, for example, you will still find the old lead pipe in there. You also find still some old appliances in there and so on, which can compromise the water quality. Water quality also degrades relatively quickly. If water sits in a pipe for a long time, that's when, of course, it starts to get issues with bacteria, because you get Legionellas as well. Water normally, when it comes through the ground, comes in at a temperature of 10, 12 degrees, which is low enough that you maintain a good water quality. You also want to keep water moving. As long as it changes and moves, you normally don't get the bacteria built up. And that's mainly true for the water main. Where you have stagnant water in your house, for example, especially long pipe runs, that's where you can compromise water. What we do is we focus first, of course, on how we use the water in the house. Where we get our drinking water from, where we use the water for showering and so on, and where we use it for appliances like washing machines. So what we try to do is we define, of course, our kitchen tap. That's where we normally get our drinking water, potable water from. That connection should be as short as possible, and it should also be that we then have high-end users behind the kitchen tap, so that we have a constant flush through the pipework relatively close to it. To the kitchen tap, we normally use in our buildings a stainless steel pipe connection because it's antibacterial. It is a bit more expensive, but if you keep that connection short, it's typically a meter, 1.5 meter, that is where we focus on. The rest of the water system, we then just design it to an adequate level, really, and that depends on the water quality, it depends on the softness of the water, pH value, and so on, what materials we normally use so that they don't get affected by it. And that is a good strategy for it. We wouldn't normally not recommend water filtration in buildings in the UK, because a water filter is only as good as you maintain it. And that's a tricky thing with water filters because it doesn't show really. You can't check it as easily as an air filter. And the problem is also because it also depends heavily on demand, but also, of course, on your water quality in the first place. If then that filter builds up, or residues build up in that filter, it can actually backflush into your system, because you then have ideal conditions, warm, stagnant water in a filter with lots of organic material which was filtered out where good bacteria and mold can dwell on. And we don't want to get that into the system. So water filters need to be maintained, and you have a good understanding on it. And typically, it's not required to get a decent water quality in there. So the lower risk is actually not to have a water filter, have decent materials in there, design it in the way that where you get your drinking water from, you flush it regularly through that and have short connections to that point. And then you're normally relatively good with that.
Outdoor spaces as well. I know many home builders don't really think too much beyond the walls of what you're making. So what should we bear in mind there?
It is. And it's also not just about the physical health, it's also about the mental health. So it is also about how we create communities, how we live together. And that starts on a large scale, where we live in cities, or where we live more in the countryside, for example. And there's no right or wrong. But there are, of course, issues with city living. The high-dense city living, of course, creates more air pollutants that, with particulate matters and so on, has an impact on us. City living, for example, if you look at high-rise cities, also has less open space. We spend less time in the outside. And of course, the best fresh air you can get is not in buildings. The best fresh air and environment is outside. Go outside, get some sun, get some fresh air on a regular level. That's the best thing you can do for your body, really. And you can never get within an enclosed environment like a building to that level anyway. So that's what you should seek. And of course then, the immediate living environment has to provide that. Also, of course, on your level of fitness. It depends whom you're working for, or how these people live their lifestyle, how much opportunity they have to get outside. So outside spaces become, of course, very important for the mental health thing, for bringing people outside, but also for social interaction. So social interaction is as equally important for a healthy lifestyle as is the immediate living surroundings. So building biology also looks at the urban design patterns, where there are better forms of living that you should consider, how you can integrate with landscape. There's a big connection also to permaculture principles in these as well. It is about a system design. It's not stopping at your door. That's a healthy living environment. You have to consider every step. But then again, it's also, you can't have these, of course, in every project. And of course, some projects, when you look at flats, don't offer that opportunity. But that doesn't mean you can't have a healthy living environment. It's not about that. It's, as I said, it's trying to improve it wherever possible. Use every opportunity for that. And if you're at the start of a project and you have the opportunity to create external spaces as well as healthy internal spaces, then that's the ideal. If you then can have an impact on the regional planning and the urban design of these as well, when you put together a new extension to a city, for example, then of course make use of these opportunities. And that starts, of course, with your energy grid as well. That starts, of course, bring it back to radiation, where you have your mobile phone masts, for example. That starts with these as well, how you supply energy and resources, water to the scheme, but also how these spaces that you create interact and how you create social spaces in between as well, which support family living as well as elderly for every part and every member of our society, a holistic approach in that as well.
Is there anything missing from our overview here that you want to touch on?
I think we covered a lot already on a high level. And I think that all shows the complexity of design in the first place and what we have to consider when we put buildings together nowadays. Something that we forget about quite easily in the everyday life when building regulations and in general focus more on low carbon and health and safety rather than other factors of that. And that's where you immediately get dragged into these fields and other elements you sort of get left out a bit. I think building biology is about, yes, putting that right, bringing that focus back on a human being and how to create that, a healthy living environment. I think something that I would like to stress at the end is probably the key thing is it's not about being too fanatical about it. And it's not about worrying people about their environment too much. It is not about that we have some critical substances everywhere in our living environment, and we have that in our lifestyle choices as well. If you look at the press, for example, we have the issue with red meat, which is suddenly on the list of carcinogenic agents and so on, and some people get really worried about it. It's all about the concentration as well. So it's how much you expose yourself, and in many of these fields you have a choice. And it's also getting the right balance. Not every carcinogenic substance will automatically lead to cancer. You have a choice there, it's a lifestyle choice, and a healthy person can cope with these things. So nobody should be too worried about and sort of get rid of their phone and household electricity altogether and move into the countryside. It's more about a reasonable approach to it and trying to improve wherever you can, really. And I think that's what I like to stress. Don't be too fanatical about it, be reasonable about it, but first try to understand what you can do. And if one looks into it seriously, you will be surprised how far you can get with very simple measures with minimal impact on your lifestyle.
And finally, we talk a lot about self-build on this podcast. Mm-hmm. Do you have any self-build examples that you might be able to share with us?
We have a project which is called Sherwood, which is for a self-builder. It's a passive house, self-built, where we also design the landscape to permaculture principles and where we apply best practice in building biology. On this project, we are pushing it quite far because the client is quite keen on it, which is probably getting relatively close to the ideal for a healthy, low-energy environment. This project will also be Passive House certified, where the client is quite keen on. And this building has been designed as a timber frame building so the client can have a maximum input, doing the work with his own hands, at the same time, of course, reducing costs as well at the same time. There's that element as well. We use local materials, maximize that. We use untreated timber throughout that material. We use paints, natural paints, mineral paints throughout. We look at the wiring of the building. We look at healthy air quality, not just from the mechanical ventilation system. This building has also not been designed that we squeeze every level of energy efficient out of it to meet passive house. We have some areas where, for example, for ventilation rates, we are a bit higher. Where, for example, in terms of daylight, we have larger areas of glass to provide optimum daylight, and we're not getting the most energy efficient form out of it. It makes better use of the landscape, how it responds to the landscape, how we create spaces, how we interact in there as well. It still meets with reasonable constructions and reasonable budget passive house levels, but at the same time doesn't compromise on air tightness. We have a well thought through natural ventilation strategy in there as well. So outside the heating season, you can switch off your mechanical ventilation system. You have a good natural ventilation strategy through cross ventilation and stack ventilation in this building as well. So the client has these options to use this building in different ways. There are some examples on our website, Sherwood, and projects if somebody's interested in that as well. We also use these principles. What we're doing at the moment quite a bit is where people are concerned or clients are concerned and they have their project on site at the moment and they realize suddenly they've bought into a eco project, and when it comes to site and they realize materials are delivered to site, these are not quite the materials they were expecting. They suddenly see highly processed, high-performance insulation arriving on their site, and that was not what they were thinking of when they instructed somebody to design an eco project for them. They were thinking of natural materials. So that's when these clients come to us and ask for just some guidance on how these materials can be substituted for something more healthy. But first of all, is there an impact? Is there a health risk from these? Do I have an alternative? And then, can I afford that alternative? And at that stage, of course, because the client budget is limited, it gets a compromise in there. But as I said before, you shouldn't be too scared about these things. You should be realistic about it. It's not like if you just use one of these elements in your building, it will kill you immediately, and that's it. It's also where it is in the building. Where you have high ventilation rates, for example, if it's more on the outside of the building, so it can gas off to the outside, it's more safe on that side. There might be different issues in terms of ecological aspects of these materials as well, but in terms of health, a lot can be done. And then the focus can be more on the materials which are on the inside, which are closer to you, which directly affect your air quality. And this is how we work with these clients to do these small tweaks, and quite regular self-builders who also, of course, want to know more about products which are not that highly specialized, which have to be ordered from Germany, Austria, Scandinavia in large quantities, which are more available to commercial house builders rather than the normal domestic house builder, who has more access to the local builders merchant, and where he can resource these natural materials from local builders merchant. And that's where we help people as well, which is the key thing. And there are more and more of these products are becoming available online as well as from local merchants.
Well, I really enjoyed this today, Thomas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session at houseplanninghelp.com/139, where you can review the key points, take a look at the case study we've talked about, and also if you have a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can do that at the bottom of the show notes. We'll link you across to Gale and Snowden Architects, houseplanninghelp.com/139. Let's finish up with an iTunes review and a look at the hub. First of all, this in from Frankie B UK, and he says, House Planning Help is essential listening for anyone interested in learning more about self-build and energy efficient houses. Having started with the very first episode and slowly working my way through, I feel as if I've learnt at the same pace as the producer, Ben Adam Smith. The podcast is easy to follow and Ben's excitement and enthusiasm for the topic really shine through. Each episode features industry experts or people who have their own projects to showcase, and Ben's interviews are always spot on. House Planning Help does what it says on the tin, and to a very high standard. Hey, thank you for that, Frankie B. It's always lovely to see these reviews at times when behind the scenes perhaps things aren't coming together as smoothly as I would like. So really appreciate the fact that you're enjoying it and that you've written that review. So if you are listening and you haven't had a chance to leave a review yet, we would really appreciate that. You just head into the iTunes store. It's very easy to do once you've found the podcast House Planning Help. And our hub update then, well, what's going on? The Long Barrow case study, we're actually up to date now. I suppose I didn't say this in the last podcast, but because Alex Baines had some financial issues, he lost his job and he had to put the project on hold, that is where it is to this day. We were operating in a bit of delay. If you don't know the full story, maybe go back into the archives and listen to episode 100, where Alex is really frank. He takes us through the progress up to today and then talks about what it means. And I actually think that the project's about to come back into the next phase. I suppose if there was one silver lining at all, it was that he's building with concrete and really this has very little impact stopping. Before you got weather tight on other build methods, it might not have been as simple. So we've got all of those in the hub, all of those videos. We had one on plot assessment, on the dig, on insulating the slab and why you do that, and the concrete pour and the basement walls and the steel frame, and just all the ICF construction, the roof going on. And that's where we pause at a moment. We'll pick this up again as it continues on whenever that will be. So that's part of the hub. We've got our video series. We're trying to find the second case study as we speak. In the meantime, instead of those videos going in, because obviously we can't continue with that, we'll have a few self-build success stories. We're working on that at the moment. Our monthly modules, we put in one on roofing options, and we are also creating one at the moment on building that team and in what order you should bring people together. Because everyone always says on this podcast, I like it, when do you want to be involved? Right at the beginning. So how does that work in practice? That's what we're working on for now. We have the private members forum, which is a closed Facebook group, works really nicely, everyone getting to know each other as well as asking questions, and the quarterly progress calls. If you want to find out more, perhaps you're someone who's just been sitting on the fence. Well, look, in secret, you can go and have a look at houseplanninghelp.com/join. Just check it out. What have we got on offer there? Have a look, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, we're doing a mini-series on a few professions, so we'll do that over a few podcasts. And the first one is looking at quantity surveyors. What exactly is a quantity surveyor, and how do we get involved with them? Is that something that the architect, in fact, will hire the quantity surveyor? We're going to discuss all of that with Jerry Thomas from Smith Thomas Consult. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.